Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We're going to talk about Los Angeles today, and we are going to talk about everything coming out of it's. I sort of struggled to think about what to start with because what you start with sort of defines how you see it. And I was going to say, we're going to talk about the protests and the National Guard and the Marines, but of course, it doesn't start with the protests. It starts with these raids, these ICE raids in Los Angeles, or I'm not sure they're all. Los Angeles is sort of a funny city that it kind of blends out into other jurisdictions and so forth. But I think the initial protests were fairly organic. They were in reaction to these raids. And I'm sure you've all seen it, but you have these, highly militarized ICE squads. One of the places they went was a Home Depot. It's sort of the Home Depot thing itself is very telling because what are you doing there? This is I don't know if it's every part of the country. Some of I grew up in the greater Los Angeles area, but Home Depot is a place where you have day laborers. It's a place for day laborers to find contractors to work for, and vice versa. So it's one of these things where, kind of by definition, you are going to a place where you're looking to arrest people who are looking to work, and they're in a place where there's demand for their labor. Um, and it is sort of an illustration of how far we are from, just arresting the bad guys. The as Trump will often put it, the gang members and the murderers and the rapists and the drug dealers and all that kind of stuff. The What never gets said enough in our political and campaign conversations, at least in the mainstream press, is that it's every administration's priority to deport violent criminals. That's obvious. That's always the first on the list. And violent criminals are also kind of hard to find. They don't go to places where police are, where ICE is likely to be, and all that kind of stuff. So, and since these raids, and LA was not we have seen these sort of stepped up pace of these raids over the last week or two. And what we have found out since is that these were uh, or confirmed since, this is specifically because the daily numbers that ICE was putting together, which I think was, five or 600 people arrested and eventually deported each day. They wanted to get that up to 3,000, which is obviously a pretty big multiple. And Stephen Miller apparently went over to ICE headquarters, wherever that is in the greater DC area, and said, "Why don't you just go to a Home Depot?" Because in a certain way, that kind of makes sense. If you're just trying to put together numbers, that is where you have a lot of undocumented people congregating, because again, that's where you go to get day labor jobs. So, as we've seen, it has escalated in a number of different directions since then. And where do we jump off on this, Kate? What is the current state of this?
Yeah, I have to say that this week has felt a little bit Rubicon crossing to me. in part because this is just it feels like we're seeing something come to fruition that has been so long promised and kind of dreamt of by the Trump camp. It's well known that he regrets not reacting more punitively to the protests over George Floyd's murder in 2020. And that's something he talks about all the time, right? That he was kind of determined at like the first sign of trouble to bring down the iron fist. And then, as you said in the intro, this wasn't even really like an organic outburst of protest. It was a pretty direct response to this like escalation of clearly not going after quote unquote criminal elements, but going after people who are working. That's the whole kind of point. And then there was a fairly muted but kind of natural response to that from the community. And then immediately it was, we're bringing in the National Guard, we're bringing in active duty military, right? And then that was a pretty clear attempt, I think, to escalate things. And of course, the reaction to that is to make them bigger. And now they're starting to kind of spring up in other cities. But the thing that is so striking to me is that, we all lived through 2020. Like most of us saw in person what a kind of notably enormous protest movement looks like. And I think it's been to many of our chagrin that that has not really emerged in the second Trump administration. This is such of a piece with what we've been talking about for weeks and months, that the response to this authoritarian power grab has been depressingly muted and kind of restricted to people who you'd expect, to be mad about this, kind of the high news consumers or whatever. So
Right.
it all feels kind of artificial. It all feels kind of orchestrated. Like they're all kind of just really chomping at the bit to get all Rambo'd up. They seized on like the thinnest kind of premise to do so, a pretty small protest in a city that's quite used to handling much larger protests. And now, it's just hard not to be worried about escalation. I feel like every day since this has happened, I just keep waiting for somebody to get hurt or killed, and having the police there is kind of bad enough. We're seeing the kind of classic hallmarks of over aggression of the one caught on film aiming and shooting at a reporter. It's just with a less lethal round, but it's just having all these other X factors there, having federal forces, having active military there. Like, even though you hope what's going to end up happening is all these people are going to be standing around, right? And the kind of worst thing that's going to come of this is they spend some hours like guarding the federal courthouses and, getting yelled at and stuff. And then they just crowd into whatever basement they're all in to sleep, kind of thing. But it's just when you have someone like this unstable at the top of things and his lieutenants are just as kind of bloodthirsty and unstable, and then you have Fox News and the right wing apparatus doing its due diligence of, wall to wall coverage of like whatever small outbursts of like burning cars and looting that there is. It's just like hard to feel confident that this isn't going to spiral into something, increasingly violent and increasingly authoritarian.
Yeah, I mean, there is, I guess in my mind, it's important to, there were sort of two protest phases in Trump's first term. There was the uh, there was the one that started um, right when he was inaugurated, the Women's March, the protests at the airports because of the Muslim ban, and I think uh, the two I think are very different. And the first one, I think, and this is really, I think, why just the whole mood is different in the second term. That uh, you know. I was going to say rightly or wrongly. In a certain sense, I think by definition it was wrong, although maybe in different ways of looking at it, you could say it's not that clear. But people thought when Trump was elected and then inaugurated that this big accident, this big mistake has happened, and that, um, you know, informed, right-thinking opinion knew that, and it's the minority. People wondered about the various kinds of interference in the election. They thought that people thought Hillary was going to win, so it was a free vote. But everything was sort of based on the idea like, okay, this was a mistake. Like, not just a mistake, as in we shouldn't have elected Donald Trump, but like we fumbled the ball. And so we're going to go out and make clear that this is just not acceptable or even real in a certain way. And if we kind of push hard enough, it will kind of fall apart. Uh, and but people knew when he was elected again, A, because we'd already seen him be president. People knew he could win. He actually won. He actually, kind of it, it was a little misleading because you had to wait for all the votes to come in, but he did win a plurality of the vote. He got more, actually more votes. So I- that's why my sense of the lack of opposition or the lack of resistance, I have always thought it's that criticism or that disappointment is a little off because I think people recognize it's a different situation. He was actually elected. So it's not like we're going to go out and protest and and it's going to like fall apart. More people wanted him than didn't want him. And then obviously the George Floyd thing was about George Floyd, about police brutality, about Black Lives Matter. I have always thought that a huge driver of that was the pandemic. It happened after people had been shut up in their homes for 2 months, and that had a big psychological effect and everything. Um, and he did get pretty wild in DC, as you know, right? I mean, things got really weird in DC. Yeah, I guess I was just looking on the site before we started, Kate, and I guess they're getting out of court filings now that the plan is that they are going to have National Guard and Marines go with the ICE raids. And I guess that at least as I have seen this reported, they are saying go with, because obviously there's a whole set of legal issues about soldiers doing policing for good reason and very kind of bright letter law. So I guess they're kind of creating this thing like they're not going to do any policing; they're just going to sort of like escort them. Um, Yet another kind of thing here. I'm sure you saw this, Kate. That they still haven't come up with rules of engagement for that the Marines have in these civilian areas, and that's a pretty big problem because you know Marines are it's a fighting force, it's a killing force, so you need to have some guidance for everybody's sake about what they're supposed to do. So yeah, it's a little Rubicon-y.
It's you don't want to see like soldiers in these vistas, like there was that video that's been well circulated now, but of Trump kind of speaking to them and they're cheering when he wants them to cheer and booing when they want him to boo. And it's like,
Yeah.
you don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this, right? Like there's a whole lot of right-wing people in the military. It's like in some ways a pretty conservative institution, in some ways a very bifurcated institution where there is also a lot of political difference between kind of your more the enlisted side and then the officer side, and that comes with all different educational attainments, different kind of requirements to hold these roles, on and on
Hmm.
and on. But it's just a little scary, you know, and it is hard not to feel like everything they're doing is trying to acclimate people to this new reality in order to heighten it. I mean, we've been saying this with the kind of deportation stuff for ages, right? Like, you start with the most vulnerable people, even though they didn't really do that. They've kind of like pretty quickly moved on to much more sympathetic cases. You know, people
Right.
have been in the country for forever and who have no criminal history and all that. But yeah, I don't know. It brings home for me, I guess, like how powerful the kind of right wing media machine is, that it doesn't, you just get this like kind of despairing feeling that it doesn't matter what the situation on the ground is. Like, protests have always been good TV, and there's just no possible way to police every member of a protest, you know, to kind of keep them from doing destructive things that look good on TV. And as long, as long as they have that, I guess. And just, I know that you may feel a little differently about this, but with what feels to me like the real kind of lethargy of people in response to everything that's happening,
Hmm.
I just don't. What do you do? You know, it's like kind of that classic thing on Twitter when people are like, "This is not normal," you know, like, "Wake up." It's like,
Right. Right.
agreed.
Right.
And I mean, it is my best recourse, you know, to kind of hope that things don't get totally escalated before 2026. You know, it all feels kind of hopeless to me right now.
Yeah. No, I agree with that, and yeah, I'm not on the lethargy front. I'm not sure I disagree that much. I just, have this idea that, again, I think people know they're in this for the long haul this time, right? That it's not like I do think to a certain extent people thought in 2017, all right, there was a glitch, right? There was sort of like a malfunction, and let's just, kind of all get out there and make clear how bad a malfunction it was. It does feel like the White House has all the cards in its hands, in a basic operational sense. And one of the things that has come out, um, not just here, it has come out in a different way with the grant funding and all this kind of stuff, that uh, as we have seen in on those other areas, courts have turned Trump back on a number of fronts, but the executive is the one that gets to do things. And so I mean, that's literally what the term means. It's the doer, right? And because of that, um, so they get turned back half the time. Well, if you're batting 500, that's not bad. Not bad in baseball. Probably not, not that bad in government either. And that they can come back and do more things, right? That there's not in other legal contexts, you have, you know, you can get in trouble with the judge, and there's sanctions, right? So you push the limit enough times, you get in trouble. Well, the executive doesn't get in trouble. That's not the it's not the that's not the structure of the legal system. Executive can get turned back, and in a few cases, judges might say you have to stop this whole thing, but that's like this whole thing, like this agency or stuff like that. So it does feel, just in an atmospheric and in a reality sense, they have the initiative, right? They can kind of keep escalating, and this is why, as you said, everybody's always talked about this, because they have these legal channels where they can just kind of declare emergencies and, like, literally send in the troops.
Right. I mean, there's also one piece of this that we should talk about. which I find so totally tiresome, which is the kind of protest policing. Like, there's been this ongoing uh conversation about how like burning the Waymos is playing right into Trump's hands, right? And like spray painting is violent and stuff like that. And uh, AOC put this like really well, I think, in whatever you call them, tweets on Blue Sky. She said, "It is 100% carrying water for the opposition to participate in this collective delusion that Dems, for some reason, need to answer for every teen who throws a rock rather than hold the Trump admin accountable for intentionally creating chaos and breaking the law to stoke violence. They are in charge." Which I think is like it's well put, and it's this constant asymmetry that I think is like one of the most important things to understand about American politics, which is like anyone even loosely associated with the left and like does the connection does not even need to be as solid as like a self-identified Democrat, someone who votes for Democrats, like anyone even aesthetically associated with the left becomes the responsibility of like the Democratic Party institutionally, right? Like they have to kind of answer for this.
Hmm.
And she's totally right. You know, nobody is saying like, and what does the Trump administration have to say about, you know, the LAPD guy who aimed and fired at a reporter wearing, you know what I mean? It's just like the two kind of grand sides of the struggle are just like not made the responsibility of their ideological allies the same way.
Yeah.
And this kind of tone policing stuff has been like every day, you know, it's like you're giving him what he wants, you're playing into his hands, like, and I'm just what do you want, what do you want them to do? You know, like I have many criticisms for Democrats right now, but like they cannot make every person in LA protest in like a non-telegenic way. You know, like that's just not going to happen. And also, doesn't this whole episode prove that that theory is just silly? Like they sparked this on purpose, you know? They like did raids that they knew would capture, you know, sympathetic neighbors of people, hoping that it would anger people and that would give them pretext to kind of bring down the hammer. So I don't know. The whole everything Democrats do is Democrats' fault, everything Republicans do is also Democrats' fault thing. Just like it really does kind of strike you at a time when Trump is like calling in the Marines and clearly just fingers crossed, like hoping that he gets the chance to, you know, use violence on like protesting American citizens.
Yeah. I mean, uh, I have a bit more of a two minds take on this. On the one hand, I mean, there's two ways people come at this. There are certainly people out there kind of blaming, kind of like, oh, this guy lit a car on fire. Oh, Democrats, what are you going to do about that? Blah, 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 blah. I do think there are people who want these protests to be successful and want Donald Trump to lose in this broader engagement, and they want to have the best they want to have the best images possible. There's a reason why, at least in the mainstream of the civil rights movement, they went out of, a significant part of this the nonviolence and civil disobedience model is you generate these pictures where the other side looks terrible, right? You're kind of, they're kind of hauling off and manhandling people who are not resisting, and there's a whole debate in the history of what we call the civil rights era, kind of mid late 50s through the mid 60s, that the leaders of the people around, you know uh the SELC and SNCC at a certain point, they would even do things that don't look great to us now in retrospect. They're always looking for these kind of test cases to when they a child to be the one who integrates a school. And there are stories we hear now about, I mean, that were known now but have become more discussed now, where one a high school student gets picked, but it turns out she got pregnant once, and maybe had a kid out. Ooh, we're not gonna, you want someone who is just like textbook perfect. And there is a very understandable retrospective debate, um, uh, about, does does every black student who's part of integration have to be perfect, right? Do they have to be like literally perfect to be the? But there, so there is. I do see. Uh, I think there are a lot of people in good faith saying things like that, as well as a lot of people who are just trying to blame Democrats for everything, or blame any protesters for everything. I guess, and I've done some of that myself, not trying to blame, just kind of like, this is much better if there are not acts of violence, even acts of violence against property. Having said that, you know, you're not going to get mass protests without someone lighting something on fire. And I really wish that would not happen, because it it does play into what um the narrative that Trump wants of, hard-fisted order versus disorder. And a lot of people will move towards order, in if you can sort of define it like that. But you also can't be in a situation where you kind of say, all right, we'll never let anybody protest, or because you're going to get some pictures. And so I think we need to kind of be, you know practical about this, while also in a positive way, uh, making clear, or at least having a discussion about what is our goal here. Our goal here is to discredit Donald Trump. And so, you know everybody involved can sort of do their part in trying to angle things in that direction, while also again saying that, you're not going to exercise control over what are fairly organic protests. And when I say that, it's not like, the Selma March, right? Where it's a highly structured thing for a very specific effect. Most of the people have done nonviolence training and stuff like that. So you have both things. I mean, the one thing I will say here, I know that I'm sure our listeners are picking this up. This has been a kind of a bit of a downcast episode so far. That and this has not gotten a lot of it has not gotten a lot of attention yet, because I think it is off narrative. But we do have one poll out there. Maybe there are more now, but we yesterday, we had the first poll out that was um, uh, after Trump had federalized the National Guard. I believe also after he had at least kind of put out word that he was going to, send in Marines, maybe before he had actually done it. It was really unpopular. Like, support for both was like in the mid 30s%. And the opposition to it was you know 10-15 points higher, or something like that. And there was, interesting, not surprisingly, there was all that you can add up the numbers. There was a lot of uncertainty about it, people not really sure. And people, those polls showed people weren't crazy about the protesters either. But as you said, the protesters are not on the ballot, right? I mean, the protesters are not Gavin Newsom or whatever. And the guy who pointed this out is this guy G. Elliott Morris, who was the last head of 538 before ABC shut it down. He's now got his own Substack. Definitely check it out. I'm a kind of fan of his. Um, he pointed this out that again, it's almost not surprising that there's a relatively negative view of the protesters, because who do you see? You see people like lighting cars on fire. That's on, like, it's certainly on permanent Q on Fox. But even at the other places, that's what, that's what you, so in any case, this does eventually come down to public opinion. And the first data we've seen is that people don't like this. And I think they'll like it less. I don't think most people like the idea of a president sending in the military everywhere. It's just, it doesn't feel right. It's scary. It's weird. It's not American.
And in terms of like the more carefully planned protests, there's going to be a kind of bunch of them across the country to counter program Trump's It's My Big Boy Birthday military parade that's happening in DC this weekend, which has been weird to be here for because they'll just like will have tanks just kind of go down the street next to you, which is funny because my husband is an army veteran and he was just talking about how insane it is to be involving tanks in a ceremonial uh display, because he was just saying like, the fuel is so expensive that to transport them you have to put them on a train or a truck, and he was like they're just so heavy and huge and unwieldy and like not made for city infrastructure, which we know because DC has had to budget like 16 million extra dollars for the damage that they're going to do to the streets. So you just will be like kind of riding your bike around the city or something, and it's like, oh, there are the tanks, like there are the missiles. It's pretty jarring while all this is happening in LA. But they have these counter protests. It's, they're no kings protests is kind of the uniting thread, and kind of a key point of emphasis is they're not having one in DC
Yeah.
because Trump has already been projecting like if there's any protests we're coming down hard. He really really wants there to be counter protesters
Yep.
here to kind of start a fight with. So they're in some other cities. I think Philadelphia is kind of the primary one, and the organizers are doing all they can to say we want peaceful, we don't
Yep.
want to feed his fire, and I don't want to negatively contrast LA with this because they're different beasts. I mean, it's kind of what you said about Selma. Like, not every protest has the same level of orchestration. Some are just more spontaneous than others. Some involve more seasoned protesters than others. That's
Yep.
just kind of the way that it goes. But that is, I think, a good example of people kind of trying their utmost to like cut down on the propaganda side of this, and like how the optics can kind of be used against the intention. And I also think that the no kings thing is kind of interesting because I mean this is an old debate now, but we were going back and forth about oligarchs for a while. Like that was the Bernie AOC tour, the Stop Oligarchs tour, and I think it was Alyssa Slotkin said something kind of snotty about how no one knows what that means. And Bernie was like, oh, I don't think people are as dumb as she whatever, this kind of back and forth. But, Kings is kind of a neat way to get past the concern that it's too big an SAT word. Everyone knows what a king is. Like, kings have a special kind of place of contempt in American history in particular. And it does kind of create a funny bait to like bring in the forces of the state to disrupt No King's Day is a
Yep.
pretty,
Yep.
is kind of stark image.
This is a recurring issue that I think we are going to be thinking about, need to think about at least for the next 3.5 years. That American civic culture has there is eh, there is a robust package of ideas and imagery, uh, and politico cultural stuff that is deeply baked into American civic culture, and it is all pretty hostile to this stuff. We have, there are some things that are more the product of the Cold War era that go a little in the opposite direction. But again, no kings. It's pretty, even things like it hasn't gotten hasn't gotten a lot of usage, but it's written right there in the Constitution. You can't quarter troops in people's houses. Now, in the modern uh, in the modern setup, although it looks like they're getting kind of close in LA right now. They sent these National Guard in without any place of where they're going to sleep, so they're sleeping like in a basement or something like that. But there is a meta message beyond that is not just I don't have to put up 6 soldiers in my house. It's that we don't want soldiers around. So, and soldiers can be great, but not in our civilian areas. We don't want to be like under military occupation. And again, there's some of the inflections of American political culture that go back in the sort of post World War II era is a little different, but there used to, there was a lot of not not it's hard to say whether you want to call it anti-military thinking in sort of American civic culture, but not liking the idea of big standing armies. Obviously, we've sort of crossed that bridge. Um, I don't think people like it, and I think the Kings thing is great. I'll get in my own little bit of snark. I noticed that they had that welcome fest thing in DC like a week ago with the sort of the abundance people, and I found they were talking about this. I find it very rich that the sort of the people who are building a movement around the word abundance are shaming other people about using big words. I mean, who the fuck says abundance? No one says no one says abundance. It's this kind of weird Latinate word. In any case, yeah, I don't know. Look, I think it is wise of them not to do. Nothing good is going to come out of doing a big organized protest in DC during that. If nothing else, probably get some people really hurt. Um, uh, I do suspect, though, there's certainly going to be like protests. There's no way
Totally.
you're gonna get, and it'll probably be the more kind of incendiary kind of Antifa kind of stuff. So I don't know. I I'm sure they think this is good to do this big military birthday parade kind of right in the midst of the LA stuff. But I'm not so sure. I think it's going to seem weird to people. Um and just one last point, if for listeners, if you follow the Axioses and the Politico newsletters and stuff like that, they've been filled recently with these little items like Trump White House. They're stoked. They think this is great for them. They're looking at the polls. It's a total winner. Well, no shit, they're going to say that. Like, and to a certain extent, they may well believe it because that's how their minds work, right? They're not like Democrats where they're constantly second guessing everything. But I'm not so. I think it'll look weird to people. I don't think it'll be good politically for them, quite apart from whether it is good.
Yeah, I mean, of all the times to kind of drop this big Soviet style hail to the chief spectacle, a time when you have newly introduced concern in people about turning the military on the American people is probably like a little bit of strange timing to be saying, "Hey, look, here's all my big weapons. Look how lethal I am." I agree. I'm not sure that's a total slam dunk.
I'm curious how they are planning the visuals, whether it's going to be like a Red Square thing where Trump is up there, you know,
Right.
as everybody goes by. Because again, uh, th- this goes back to what I was saying before about um, the answer to getting no violent images whatsoever is to just say we're not going to do any protests because the risk is too high, and that's silly. And this has come up again and again, that I do think, one of the things that we one of the recurring themes we've seen in recent months is that elites tend to be really cowed. And it makes sense in a way, because elites have a lot of, kind of, for lack of a better word, assets in plain view. Power assets, wealth, you know all sorts of things. But you contrast that with, people showing up at the town halls. Y- there's different ways for public opinion to express itself. And the biggest one, the most important one, is at elections. But there's other ways it does too. And I have a, I have a some level of confidence that, again, I don't think people, we've been trained, most of us, our whole lives, to look at military parades and, kind of leaders reviewing them and stuff, and thinking like, ooh, that's North Korea, that's,
Hmm.
USSR. It's not, uh we don't do that here. Tanks
I
and
mean,
missiles, it's weird.
right. And it's not going to matter, I don't think, because it's Trump, but like the logistical sacrifices that are accompanying this display beyond the damage and the money to fix the damage are like so immense that in a previous era you could see them, any of them singularly, kind of like ruining a politician's career. Like they're shutting down DCA for multiple hours completely, like grounding all flights in or out of a major airport for Trump's birthday party. Like the delays on the roads around DC are expected to be like hours, if not days. It's like it's completely just, I mean, and I know people don't think of people who live in DC as real people, but it's completely shutting down like a major American city for something that nobody asked for, for no matter what they say, oh, it's the army's birthday, bullshit. We knew he wanted to do this in the first term too. Like for his birthday party, for an elderly man's birthday party, everything is getting shut down. And I mean, I just think it's a little bit due to the impotence of the Democratic Party that this hasn't been more of a weapon. It at the very least should be a pretty easy way to say, like, by the way, this guy is an enormously vain buffoon. Like, don't forget about that underlying all the rest of it.
Yeah, I do feel like I feel like a few weeks ago there was a lot of talk about, oh, he's doing a big military parade on his birthday, and that has been sort of worn down a bit in the coverage over the last week or so. Oh, it's 250th anniversary of the U.S. military, which I guess, is it actually the army? The
It's
Marine.
the army, yeah.
But I'm curious when the Marines were created before the whatever. In any case, uh,
Hey, if the army's birthday didn't line up, it'd be something else, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally, totally, totally. But I do feel like I'm curious whether it's gonna it the fact of his birthday is going to it should get a little more play, since, as you said, that's what this is about, or even more. That he's in his mind, he's tight with the USR. It's like I said, I do feel like we, especially people like us who follow politics closely, who comment on it, there is we have we privilege the idea that the public needs a lot of guidance, for how to receive things, how to interpret things. And those things are important. I'm not saying they're not important, but they're not everything. And I think that people sometimes come to conclusions on their own. And you know, I don't know. I don't think. I don't think this is what anybody wants besides his kind of core people. I do think they're kind of reaping, sowing the wind, but we'll see.
Hmm. Yeah, the last thing I want to say, it's just the biggest bummer of it all is that the Elon Trump fight is like gone from the news, right? It's like the whole right is unified about having like wet dreams about, murdering protesters. That's something they all like, whether you're from like the tech right or the whatever, more MAGA tent. And Elon tweeted at 3:04 a.m., mind you, that he regretted some of what he said about Trump, that he went too far. He's taken down the pedophile stuff and the impeachment stuff. And oh my gosh, it is just like it's so fittingly pathetic for him, It's like we talked about this during when the fight was in full swing, but about how at this point it's like Elon needs Trump way more than Trump needs Elon, right? Like
Yeah,
Trump's not running again, doesn't give a fuck about other Republicans, but like Elon's entire business is premised on being subsidized and contracted with the government.
yeah,
So of course he's kind of like furiously backpedaling and trying to get into the good graces again. But I will say, for as like bright and hot as that breakup, you know, was, I could use more of it. I could have
yeah.
taken a few more weeks.
It's funny because there's I think I tweeted about this or on Blue, again, what, as you said, whatever they call them on Blue Sky, that this is a time when we need to be able to hold two things in our mind at once. That this whole thing, to a significant extent, was done to end that story, to distract from that story, to change the subject. Um, but it's also super important, right? People, it's one of the dramas of the Trump era is to get liberals or Democrats or anti-Trump people to be having this to get into arguments with themselves about which thing is the real thing and which thing is the distraction thing. And they're all real things. And what it really is this is it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, that the president has the initiative. The president has lots and lots of power. And what goes with that power is the ability to change the subject to a significant extent, even if in some ways it may not be an advantageous change of subject, right? And that really is the thing. I mean, I do think, and look, I have felt it too. It is dispiriting to feel like, wow, this guy has the reins, right? This guy can just keep doing shit and everybody has to react to him. Um and uh he's got a kind of iron grip on, you know 30 or so percent of the population that will, like, say it's awesome no matter what he does, right? But I just think we need to keep in our minds that not everything he does is helping him. And there is a significant extent, I think, that each one of these things, he kind of builds a sense in a part of the population, kind of like, what is the fucking latest thing? What the fuck? Even if you uh that poll that I referenced earlier in this episode that showed that these military deployments are not popular. Like his hard base, like 30 plus percent of the population is for it, but most aren't. Um, but the protesters aren't popular. Well, Trump is the common denominator. In a few weeks we'll be, well, maybe not, but at some point we'll be done with these protesters and we'll be on to another issue. But I do think Trump is building up a one fucking thing after another. constant drama, constant escalation. I don't think people want that. I don't think people want to see the military in U.S. streets, dragging off families, stuff like this. So, I it is really important to maintain a touch with reality, to maintain our own kind of civic composure, um, to realize that we're not in a situation where, you know, heads Trump loses, heads Trump wins and tails Trump wins, kind of anything Trump does, he wins. I don't think that's really how it is. And I don't, and that's not just a kind of hope for the best. I don't think it's factually how it is, just to kind of one, point on this front. Um, we certainly had a lot of people who said that the escalations he did at the end, before the 2020 election, the stuff that happened, the George Floyd protests, his escalations in DC, that was going to help him, blah 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 blah. He lost the election, and yes, he came back and won the election later, but not every escalation works to his benefit, and I do think he's building up a lot of opposition. Just not that people are against every last thing he does, just that he is doing a lot of things that I don't think have a big constituency, and he's ignoring other things that do have a big constituency. So, we will see what happens, but that's my thought.
All
Any
right.
other no? I guess
Nope,
that's
I think that's it for this week.
yeah, I think that's all we got. Thanks for tuning in as always, and we will talk to you next week.
See you then. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.